So our final lecture for EDU255 will go over the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and how it has changed over the last 50 years. So we'll start off with looking at how and why it was enacted, and then looking at some of the changes kind of looking at some of the overall structure of what the ESEA is all about, and then talking about some of the profound changes that we've had with various administrations at the federal level. So I'm going to start. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention was throughout the video, you will see pictures of the different presidents that were in office when various forms of the ESEA were enacted. And so if you click on the pictures, there's video links to YouTube that provide you with actual in very early on, it would be radio broadcasts, but later on it's actually televised video of the presidents addressing the nation when they sign these laws or when they sign these bills into law. So anyway, so we're going to start off with which president. This is an important fact that you should know, especially with your final coming up soon. But which president was given credit for the ESEA and why was it first enacted? So think about that. So moving on, ESEA stands for Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was enacted in 1965. It only took 3 months to get this bill drafted, passed, and sent through Congress. So that's pretty amazing. And especially if we look at how long pieces of legislation can sit in Washington at this point. President Johnson was the president given credit for this bill. He was a major proponent of education. He actually was a school teacher in rural Texas. So this lady sitting next to him is his first grade teacher, I believe. He talks about this in the radio address. So when you get to when we're done with this presentation, go back and click on this picture. You'll actually be able to hear him talk about her and talk about his time as a teacher and why he felt this bill was so necessary. This was the first major education bill. Up until this point, there was no Department of Education. There was no federal legislation that oversaw public education in the United States. And it was very far-reaching, had high standards for the first time, not as high of standards necessarily as we see today, because obviously we just keep trying to improve and get our students to have higher and higher expectations. And this was the first time there was also some accountability, which was unique because, like I said, up until this time there was no centralized federal regulations for public schools. So each state, or in some cases each school district, had their own freedom to do whatever they want. And although sometimes I think accountability can seem like a waste of time, I think it's an improvement over just everybody being able to do what they want. So anyway, the reason, and the question I asked on the previous slide, I asked why was it enacted? Really, it was enacted to combat the war on poverty. There was just, not that this was the first time there were kids in poverty, but this was one of the first times when a lot of people really gathered together and said, hey, poverty is a real problem in the US, and it's impacting kids' academic achievement. So that was the main reason that the federal government got involved with this, with education. It was a long time coming because, as we know, the first public schools were developed back in the late 1800s. And so it was just, there were so many schools and so many kids that the federal government felt that they needed to step in. So now I'm going to talk about how the ESEA is organized. And so I'm not necessarily talking about the laws that were enacted back in 1965, because I don't think it's necessary for you to know all of the original acts. But just to kind of give you an idea of what these different titles are, because you will hear about these titles as you are teaching. So Title I is probably one of the most widely known pieces of the ESEA. It was designed to close the gap in skills for reading, writing, and mathematics. And again, initially it was all about poor kids or kids in poverty. And that's still what it is. If you hear of a Title I school, they are awarded Title I funds based on the number of students that have free and reduced lunch. So it's all centered around poverty. There's $25 billion that were appropriated in fiscal year 2007. And there's different parts of Title I. So actually, there was more money appropriated for Title I, but for Part A, which is the whole reading, writing, and math section of Title I, that's how much money was appropriated in fiscal year 2007. I just couldn't quickly find an updated number. Sometimes it's hard to find exact numbers, so that was the last most recent data that I could find. And SEAs to LEAs, that's not too significant. Basically, they went from school education agencies to local education agencies. It's just how they define school districts, essentially, instead of saying districts, because some states call them districts, some call them corporations. So for federal regulation purposes, we refer to everything as an LEA, local education association, or agency, I'm sorry, local education agency. So in order to be eligible for Title I funds, your school has to have at least 40% low-income students. Again, how they base that is based on free and reduced lunch. The money goes to public and private school children, so any child in the U.S. There's two types of funds, either school-wide funds for school-wide programs or targeted funds that address specific groups of children or that have specific needs. So either school-wide, where it's a program for everybody, or targeted, so an example of a targeted use of Title I funds would be for ESL kids that are in special pull-out classes trying to learn to read, write, and do mathematics. So that would be one example of how some Title I funds could be targeted. Title I is on a 3-year reauthorization cycle. So every 3 years, once the school is awarded Title I status, it has to provide data and then reapply for their Title I status every 3 years. So as anyone that's interested in administration, going into administration or becoming a school principal, you have to know who your kids are. You have to be very vigilant about getting parents to sign off on their free and reduced lunch forms. At the high school level, many high schools that should receive Title I funds don't, because there's a stigma associated with turning in your free and reduced lunch slip in front of everybody else. So many high school principals, instead of having students turn those forms in to their classroom teachers, they've actually set up so that kids just turn in those slips at the beginning of the year with all the other slips, and maybe they just go to the guidance counselor or they go to the principal's office, or it's done on in a very low key way, so that students don't feel like they're singled out. Kids just don't like to admit that they're poor. It's just a stigma, and it's a real problem at the high school level. So administrators are very creative in finding and figuring out ways to get kids to turn in their free and reduced lunch form. So the other difficult thing is kids don't want to walk through the school lunch line and then not pay for their food. Like, to them, it's just very embarrassing. The whole process is embarrassing. So many schools have switched to just using ID numbers now, which automated systems have really helped out with that, where kids just scan their student ID card and then nobody knows. That's a major reason as to why schools have switched to that process of having a lunch account, so that kids on free and reduced lunch aren't singled out. So now also with Title I, there's LEA grants that schools can receive. So if they're wanting to do something special at their local education agency, they can apply to get Title I grants for that. Maybe they're going to do a special program with ENL kids, or they're going to do a special program with at-risk kids, or whatever the case might be. Those grants can come in the form of reading, migratory children, which tend to be a lot of ENL students, at-risk kids, like I've already mentioned, comprehensive reform if the school itself or the the district itself is trying to do some sort of comprehensive district-wide reform in writing, reading, or mathematics, they can apply for special grants. And then accountability, and there's lots of different things you can do here. Okay, so consequences of the ESEA is that a lot of general aid has now, throughout the last 50 years, has now switched to categorical aid. So general aid is aid that can be used for anything in your school to help improve the educational outcomes, whereas categorical aid is specific to programs. So maybe there'll be a categorical aid for E&L kids, and that can only be used for E&L kids, as opposed to in the past it just used to be a bucket of money and the principal or the superintendent could do with it as they wish, as long as it was improving reading, writing, and mathematics. And another consequence, and these aren't necessarily negative consequences at all, but another consequence of the ESEA in the past 50 years is that money is now given to each child in the building instead of given to the institution itself. So numbers is a really big deal, which is why getting those free and reduced lunch forms signed and turned back in, signed by the parents and then turned back in to the school, is such a big deal in the beginning of a school year. And then the federal government, because they can't oversee all states in a reliable fashion, have turned to making Title I funds the responsibility of the state education departments. And so that's just another consequence that's occurred over the last 50 years. Just to see that this is just how much money has gone into these programs since 1980. I thought it was a nice graph to kind of, or a chart, so that you can kind of see what categories the money is being spent for ESEA, and then how much money approximately. So I'll give you a second to look at that. A term that we hear very often is that the ESEA funds can be used to supplement academic programs, not supplant. So what that means is you should have programs in place that you're already doing, and then when you get these federal dollars, you're using the federal dollars to supplement those programs, to add on to those programs, as opposed to you've got programs in place and then you get the federal government's money and now you're going to spend that money for those programs you already have in place. So you have to actually add to your existing educational programs. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video because I only have 15 minutes of recording time. So this is the end of part 1, and we'll pick it up again with part 2.